Hi, how are you?
I'm doing well. How about you?
Not too bad.
Good. Welcome back to another episode of Aquarium Tech Talk. I'm Scott.
I'm Jim.
And today we're going to talk about calcium reactors.
That's what these things full of gravel are?
That's what these things full of gravel are. Purpose of a calcium reactor is to help maintain calcium levels as well as alkalinity levels in the tank. The way they work is you effectively have these canisters full of media. Typically you use one, and in many cases there's a second one that's there to help.
Looks like tubes just with gravel in them.
It looks that way, but unfortunately it's not tubes with just gravel. It actually has calcium in it, or calcium carbonate, or in this case skeletons from coral and stuff like that.
Skeletons from who?
Corals.
Coral.
Yep. Coral.
Okay. Coral.
So, but essentially as corals grow, their skeletons, consume stuff like magnesium and trace elements, calcium of course, because they're built of calcium. And the way this will work is, or the way they work, is you have carbon dioxide injected into there, which lowers the pH, and anywhere from 7.2 below, calcium starts to break down. And when it breaks down, the solution of the effluent is then pushed back into the tank, which increases calcium and alkalinity levels in the tank, and also adds strontium and other trace elements that would be embedded in the dead coral skeletons, or in this case the crushed coral as well. We're using a 2-reactor setup here, and the benefit is typically with a calcium reactor, the effluent, or the stuff that comes out of the reactor that we pump into our tank, has a much lower pH concentration, and that can have an impact on pH levels in the tank. Of course, we're pumping very slow amounts of it, and you want to have that effluent go into a highly aerated or high flow area, which helps to dissipate any leftover CO2 and bring the pH levels back up. But having the second reactor here, essentially what happens is our main reaction chamber is this big one. This is where we'll pump our CO2 into. We'll monitor the pH in this reaction chamber. That effluent from this reactor will then go into the second reactor, which has a finer particulate into it, or a finer media into it. And this will help to increase the pH before it goes into the tank.
Increase the pH or rid the water of the CO2?
Well, you're not going to rid the water of the CO2 completely. You'll rid the water of some of the CO2, and in doing so you'll help bring the pH back up before it goes into the tank water. And of course, like I said, we'll have the water from this reactor, or from the reactors, going into an area of high flow of my sump, which will help dissipate that further. And for tanks that are troublesome with pH or have low pH levels, there's other ways to increase pH without using buffer.
Air bubbles, maybe.
Air bubbles, that's certainly one way. In my case, we'll add a secondary line to a protein skimmer, to my protein skimmer, that'll draw the air from the outside of the house as opposed to the inside, where modern houses are very airtight and CO2 levels are a little bit higher inside the house than they might be outside. So by pumping fresh air into the protein skimmer, you can effectively increase the pH level. There's a number of ways to run calcium reactors. Some people will...
So let me stop you there for a second. Let me just see if I understand you. So you got this big cylinder full of some kind of calcareous gravel.
Correct. In this case, we've got a product from Two Little Fishes. It's called Reborn, and again, it's coral skeletons in here primarily.
Reborn, like a second chance, second opportunity?
Yep, like those corals that once upon a time died will hopefully be reborn into new healthy coral skeletons within the aquarium.
So you got this canister full of second chance calcareous gravel.
Correct.
And you're going to do what? You're going to pump some CO2 in there?
Well, we're going to have CO2. CO2 goes in through the CO2 inlet here, and you have to control the amount of CO2. Obviously, the more CO2 you put into here, the higher the pH level. And so we control the CO2 flow going in there not only by turning a solenoid on and off, but we have a bubble counter here. And what we're going to do is we're going to set it to about 1 bubble a minute to start. And that's 1 bubble of carbon dioxide going in here that is recirculated by this pump here. It'll recirculate the water going through there.
1 bubble how often?
1 bubble a second. Did I say a bubble a minute?
I'm not sure. I was just thinking it's probably more than that anyhow.
We'll start with about a bubble a second.
Bubble, 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 bubble.
Yeah, a lot slower than that.
Bubble, bubble, bubble.
Correct. And what we'll do, as I was saying before,
that CO2 will dissolve that gravel in there?
That CO2 will dissolve that gravel when the pH gets to a certain
And then
level.
where does that dissolved gravel go?
It'll flow out well, actually it flows out through this tubing here. It'll go into a smaller reaction chamber and then out through,
Kind of a double whammy there.
I guess you could call it that.
Whoa, exciting. Okay, so I kind of understand you.
So anyhow, so saying there's a number of ways to feed these things, and calcium reactors can be problematic. One of the big issues with calcium reactors is because of their slow flow, they have a habit of clogging up the effluent or the output line. It's highly there's a lot of calcium and stuff in there, and it tends
Because that's what you're dissolving then.
correct, and that tends to plug up the line going out. And we're going to take this and set this up a little bit differently. There's a proven method that tends to eliminate that. And going back to the ways that people run them, some people will run them off of a manifold where you feed pressure in from a pump, your return pump, or a manifold on your system, or a maxi-jet type of pump in the sump, and you feed it from the sump, and then you control the effluent with a little needle valve. So that you can slow the flow coming out, because you don't want high flow coming out of a reactor. It's typically a very, very slow flow. When I say slow flow, we're talking drops a second as opposed to a stream.
Drop, 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 drop.
What would be measured in milliliters a minute. So the way we're going to set this up is this is a medical dosing pump, commonly referred to as a Cole-Parmer pump. There's an awful lot of different variations.
Put some legs in that. It'd look like one of those big monster stormtrooper things in Star Wars.
Sure, yes it would.
Okay.
So there's a number of these different pumps out there. Some that have a dial control. This happens to be a digital one. I picked it up, used off of eBay. Carries a different name, Carter, but it is
So
made.
some dialysis patient out there is minus his pump.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly that. Dialysis or IV, whatever the hell they use them for. But as I was saying, there's a number of different flavors of these pumps. This one happens to be digital. They feature quick change head, so if your tubing goes bad, you can change out the tubing in a matter of moments.
And so this is called a what kind of pump?
It's a medical dosing pump made by a company called Cole-Parmer. Also,
Typically referred to as a peristaltic pump.
correct. It's a high-end peristaltic pump.
So there's a set of what, rollers in there
There's
that
a set of
roll
rollers.
across the tubing, and
That's correct. It's got stainless rollers. Unlike your typical aquarium dosing pump, though, these are rated for continuous duty, meaning I can run this pump 24/7, and it's designed to hold up to that. And the beauty of these pumps is you can actually control the rotates per minute or the flow. Some of them you can set it to milliliters a minute. In this case, I'll be controlling based on RPM. This particular size tubing runs about 2.7 milliliters a minute per rotate per minute. We're going to set it up at about 50 milliliters per minute, and I calculate it's about 17.8 RPM to get about 50 milliliters a minute, which will be, not a drip, just a little bit more than the drip, but not a stream or anything of that nature. So it'll be, balanced flow. It'll give me a set point or a starting point where I can let this thing run for a couple days, assess my pH levels in here. I'll have my apex controlling my pH. That'll tell the it'll tell the CO2 solenoid to turn on and off at a preset level. We'll set this thing to about 6.5 pH, which 6.4 to 6.5 is a sweet spot, so it'll turn off at 6.4, about 6.45, and it'll turn on at 6.5. So I'll have a constant pH level in this reaction chamber of about 6.5. I'll monitor how often my solenoid turns on and off. I can do that through my apex, and based on that, I'll adjust the bubble count or the amount of CO2 going in up or down until I get to a point where my apex really doesn't have to turn it on and off. The idea is to have the appropriate amount of flow versus the appropriate amount of CO2, such that you're maintaining a constant flow of CO2 into the reaction chamber, and you're maintaining a constant pH level based on that CO2 level. So it's kind of a balancing act between flow going into the reactor and pH coming out. Now, taking a couple steps back, I mentioned some of the issues, and one of the issues with running a calcium reactor is clogging. This particular pump puts out some pretty decent PSI. I believe it's like 25 PSI. Now, some people will run the pump for the reactors so that you're feeding the water in. In our case, what we're going to do is we're going to set the pump up after the reactor, so it's actually sucking the water through the reactor. Now, you may scratch your head and ask, why would you do such a thing?
I'm scratching my head, and guess what I'm asking? Why would I do such a thing?
And the reason you would do such a thing is if, for whatever reason, the reactor effluent line or one of the reactors plugs up, you're not pressurizing the pump, or excuse me, you're not pressurizing the reactor. And the idea behind not pressurizing the reactor is that if something does plug up, you avoid leaks by having it pull the water through the reactor.
Could it blow up?
No, but you can blow a seal. And
Ooh.
when you blow a seal, you can have water on your floor. So we're going to pull the water through the reactor as opposed to feeding the water into the reactor. And that's basically for safety purposes.
So, I'm sorry, I missed something there. Repeat that. You're going to pull the water instead of pushing the water?
That's correct.
So you're going to pull water through the reactor from...
The sun.
And this is going to pull it through the reactor.
Correct. Yeah, these pumps are self-priming. They have very good suction capabilities. So with that, we'll be able to set it up and literally, same way you would suck water through a straw, think of the reactor as one giant straw leading to the fish tank, and this will draw the water from the tank through the reactor, through the second reactor, into the pump, and then we'll push it back to the tank.
So you're going to create a negative pressure inside both those reactors, a vacuum in a sense.
Effectively, that's exactly.
Which in turn is what sucks the water from, in this case you said, the sump.
Correct.
Geo's Reef, the fabricator of the world-famous Geo Calcium Reactor line, has released a new dual-chamber reactor. The CR612X2 is designed for hobbyists concerned with low effluent pH. Geo reactors utilize the bottom-up water flow method to capture free CO2 and draw it back into the circulation pump. This design consumes less gas in the reaction chamber and less gas in the effluent. Not sure which reactor is best for you? Geo provides several different models. Geo reactors are fabricated in the USA. Check out geosreef.com today.
Hi there, my name's Jim Stein and you know me as the LA Fish Guy. Well, I also wear a couple of other hats. One of them is the jellyfish tank called the Jelly Aquarium, and the third is myfishtank.com. I offer an entire line of acrylic aquariums ranging from rectangular to hexagon, flatback hex, as well as the custom curve front aquariums. There's also an entire line of stands and canopies ranging from MDF to pine to oak with a variety of different finishes available. And the website is even smart enough that you can calculate what the freight and crate charges to your location will be. That's myfishtank.com.
Do you have an aquarium question? Are you looking for aquatic answers? Just key in wetwebmedia.com. Wetweb Media has information on freshwater, marine, brackish, and planted aquariums. Wetweb Media is staffed by the capable Wetweb Media crew. Check today's facts, ask questions, or search keywords. That's wetwebmedia.com.
Of that is by not pushing it through here, we don't have to worry about a leak. You know, that can be important, especially if you have your tank in the house or you have your calcium reactor in the house. For me, this will be set up in a shed. I have water on the floor monitoring. It's not that big of a deal, but I don't want leaks. So this is my solution, and having the pump draw through the reactor will solve that issue.
Okay. So you mentioned Apex.
Apex, yes. So this is going to be controlled by my Apex. In my case, I'm out of power outlets in there. I also need a pH probe in there for the reactor. So I do have a couple items that I'll need to install in there. First is an EV4 power bar. This is 4 outlets. They're relay outlets, so they're good for low voltage.
Power bar, or maybe what they call energy bar?
They call it an energy bar, yeah.
Okay.
You know,
An Apex energy bar, that's the 4 outlet version?
That's correct. 4 outlets, and this has 4 relays. Certain devices like solenoids that are low draw, low current devices need to be on a relay outlet. The typical EB8, rather, not typical, but the EB8 has 2 relay outlets, and the other 4, or the other 3, cut. The EB8 has 8 outlets, 2 of which are relay outlets. The other 6 are triac outlets. A triac outlet is an electronic switch. It is an electronic form of a relay. The downside of the triacs is they don't deal with low current devices very well.
So if I understood what you just said, the energy bar, whether it be a 4 outlet version or an 8 outlet version, comes with certain kind of outlets or receptacles.
Correct.
And the certain ability or whatever you want to call it is what it offers is the ability to use equipment that draws more amperage or more whatever.
More or less. The triacs aren't capable of carrying very high loads, but they're also very sensitive to low loads. Now, these outlets are all controlled by the controller. So if you want to turn them on and off, a triac outlet with a very low load may have issues turning itself on and off. So if you're running something like a very small dosing pump, not like this one, but a regular dosing pump or a solenoid, you want to have it on a relay outlet.
So two questions come to mind. One, how do you define what is required on your piece of equipment?
Well, you look at the current of it. I'm not exactly sure off the top of my head what the rating or the minimum current for a triac is. I believe it's something to the tune of 15 watts for the triacs, which means that they need a device that's a minimum of 15 watts for them to operate functionally. If you have a 5-watt device on there, you might not get proper turn on and turn off.
And so for the lower drawing equipment, you would then use
a relay outlet.
a relay outlet.
Correct. Now an EV4 is 4 relay outlets versus an EV8 has
Okay,
2
so that was going to be my next question. How do you purchase, obtain, or define what it is you're getting or what it is you need in the way of a power bar?
Well, you need to be cognizant of the devices that you're going to run and do some planning. This does not just hold true with the Apex, but even devices like...
Okay, sorry to be so anal here, but I've just listed all the Apex equipment on the myfishtank.com website. And as I listed that, I saw the power bars, or which I think they call them energy bars, a 4 and an 8. I don't recall ever seeing that there was an option that allowed me to select what version of the outlet I was getting.
Not an option. The EV8 has 2 relay outlets and 6 triac outlets. The EV4 is 4 relay outlets
Okay, so 4 relay outlets
on an EV4.
on a 4, which would typically then use the lower draw equipment?
Low or high amp. A relay is capable of up to 15 amps, but it also supports lower current or lower draw devices. Whereas a triac outlet, I don't recall what the limitation of amperage is on them, but they don't function very well with devices under what I believe is 15 watts. So again, low current devices should be on a relay outlet, higher current devices can be on a triac, and very high current devices should be on a relay outlet.
Okay, so for a future discussion, maybe we can discuss more specifically what those power bars come with and what pieces of equipment would fit those outlets appropriately.
Absolutely, that will be a topic for the Apex discussion.
Ah, okay. Boy, you're just way ahead of us, aren't you?
So, getting back to what's going to be involved, we've got to have a probe in here that monitors our pH level, and my Apex will control that. This is a PM1 module. It's basically a probe module that will plug into the USB port on here. It looks like a USB, but it's not really USB. They call it Aquabus cable. And then there'll be an Aquabus cable to plug from this to another power bar that I have in my shed already, so that these two devices become networked to my Apex. Our pH probe will plug into here and then go into the top of the reactor, and we'll be able to set this up through the Apex. And while my Apex is in the house, I've already got cables run there to other Apex related devices in the shed, so networking this stuff will take a matter of moments.
So I'm going to see if I follow you here. So this unit here is what you would connect the probe to.
Correct.
And the probe itself is going to go over where?
Little probe port right here.
Oh, pretty slick. Okay, so the probe goes in there. It's going to somehow send a signal that'll be interpreted somehow by this, and that data is then sent into the power bar, which in turn somehow gets it over to the actual Apex aquarium controller.
Yeah, in layman's terms, yes.
I'm a layman, so that was good terms then, yes?
The power bar basically has a network port of sorts. It's what they call an Aquabus port. There's 4 of them, so you can connect 4 separate Aquabus devices to this, but then again, each Aquabus device has another thing, so technically you can daisy chain the heck out of these things. I forgot how many devices the base Apex supports, but you can add an awful lot of devices. In my case, I've got well over a dozen devices connected.
So something for my own education then, if you daisy chained 4 of those in a row, each one of those has its own way of being recognized.
Correct.
And so the Apex unit would, even though all 4 are daisy chained together, it would recognize the information coming to the first one, the second one, the third one?
Correct. Each one's going to get its own unique address. So it'll come up separately. That is, the probe itself will come up separately, and under modules, you'll see each probe module as well.
So the Apex will ask you, oh, you just added a second, a third, a fourth, or a fifth, and here's the number I'm going to assign to it.
Nope.
Nope.
Doesn't ask you. Just plug and play. You plug it in, it'll show up in the module list. And there'll be another pH probe in there, which it'll give a unique name to. I can go in and rename that to Calcium Reactor probe if I wanted to. But it'll create a probe, or the probe will automatically be recognized, and then I can create a program for the outlet that's going to control the CO2 solenoid and say if my pH is greater than 6.5, then off. If pH less than 6.5, then on.
And that there will turn that solenoid on or off based
Correct.
on those parameters.
Actually, it would be the opposite of that. If pH less than 6.4, then off. If pH greater than 6.5, then on. The idea is that anything over 6.5, the CO2 turns on, and anything less than 6.4 or 6.45, CO2 turns off. So you're trying to keep the pH level in here constant, and that is managed by the CO2. So you could have your CO2 solenoid going on and off, or we just, as I mentioned earlier, dial in the amount of bubbles, CO2 bubbles going in versus the amount of flow. And it's a balancing act. It'll take me, a handful of days to, get the magic number to where I get it stable. And then from there, once I've got everything here stable, then we'll start monitoring the pH and the alkalinity, the calcium levels and the alkalinity in my tank, and determine what the next course of action. My last test, my calcium level in the tank was about 350.
And how is that calcium test done?
Well, in my case, we use a Salfir test, but there's a number of different test kits out there to measure calcium, and that's something as reefers we need to be cognizant about. I don't have a lot of stony coral in my tank, and nor do I have much calcium demand other than my coralline algae and my hammers and a few other corals in there. But as my coralline and my hammers grow, my calcium uptake is greater. So this will help maintain those levels. Now, as I said, my calcium levels are low currently, and we're going to try to bring them up, and it may be that I'll be able to bring them up easily with the calcium reactor. Alternatively, I have some buffers that I can add to the tank, calcium hydroxide or calcium, whatever it is, and soda ash for alkalinity. And calcium, alkalinity, and pH, they all kind of go hand in hand. This effluent coming out of the calcium reactor will not only have a high amount of calcium, but it'll also have high alkalinity. So that has the ability to raise your alkalinity as well. And again, the idea with the calcium reactor is to maintain consistent levels, target levels. I want to maintain 425, calcium. So, eventually we'll find the balance in there, the right amount of flow going through the calcium reactor into my tank that maintains those levels. Starting off, we already know that I've got low calcium levels. We'll run a calcium and alkalinity test today and see what those numbers are. I will note those numbers a couple days after having this thing running. Once I have this stabilized, we'll go back and test those numbers, at which point I will increase the flow through the reactor into the tank to slowly, gradually raise my calcium levels. Once I hit my target level, then we back off on the flow and do testing on a daily basis to make sure that my calcium or my alkalinity isn't increasing or isn't decreasing.
So there's another variable there, and that variable, which I guess we never really did talk about, was the rate that the water is flowing through the whole reactor unit.
That's correct. As I said, there's a balancing act there of the amount of CO2 going in versus the amount of flow. If you increase your flow, you're going to need more CO2 in there to maintain the proper calcium levels. So it's a fine balancing act of what the tank needs versus the flow coming out of the reactor versus the CO2 going into the reactor. So initially we set it up to get everything stable. Then we look at what the tank's needs are. We increase the flow And when we increase that flow, our pH will gradually rise inside the reactor, so we'll have to increase our CO2 level to maintain the desired pH level to break down the coral skeletons and the calcium in there.
Wow. So, pretty fancy equipment you got there. What's the next step?
Well, the next step is going to be to go into the shed outside and mount up our components here. And then we'll plumb in. I've got to run 2 lines from my sump to the shed. One's the water line going from the tank to the reactor, and then the other one's going to be the return line going from the dosing pump back to the tank.
So, make it a point to come on back and see part 2 and see how we get this all hooked up.
Keep moving forward. See you guys soon.